Good morning, Professor Meer.
Good morning.
Miss Graham.
Thank you. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Yesterday, we were just about to explore your final slide, and I wondered if we could have that put back on the screen. This is slide 22, and it's a table. And if we see down the left-hand side, there are 3 names listed. Christopher Alder, 1998, Sean Rigg, 2008, and Olly Lewis, 2010. And then at the top, you have different columns: use of excessive force, ignoring signs of crisis, mistreatment of family, and public briefings and misinformation. And I think, is this a table where you're seeking to draw out some parallels between these 3 cases?
Yes.
But these are real cases which occurred on those in those years that you've mentioned. Can I ask you to begin with Christopher Alder?
Yes,
and,
of course.
My understanding is that Mr. Alder died in a police station in Hull.
Mm-hmm.
The IPCC investigated and looked at race in that case and concluded that a number of aspects of the behaviour of the police officers suggested unwitting racism,
Mm-hmm.
but the evidence that was considered by the IPCC in relation to the death of Mr. Alder included monkey noises had been made as he was dying, although that may have been directed towards another person in the vicinity. Is that, can I summarise it in that way? The chair will have the full details of this in front of him.
Yes, and the 3 cases that I've named and selected here, I drew from a longer list of 64, but I could have carried on for at least half with common themes across them. And 3 new cases from last year from Wales would match this criteria too, but we only had so much time and so much space. But it's just to say that the slide is really a snapshot, I think, of a common series of themes which feature in each case when you look at them closely. They all vary in detail, but the consistency across them, I think you can identify these themes.
So the chair should not assume that these are the only 3 examples from... No, thank you.
Absolutely
Could we
not.
begin by looking at the Christopher Alder themes that you've drawn out here?
So as you say, Christopher Alder died on the floor of Hull's Queen Road police station. He received a head injury in a nightclub, and he was taken from Hull Royal Infirmary, where he'd gone to receive treatment. The hospital decided he was troublesome because he wouldn't go home because he was still complaining of an injury, and that's when he was taken into custody. So he was already taken into custody with a head injury, and there's not a dispute of that. Between him being taken into custody at the hospital and arriving at the police station in Hull, he was unconscious. And so there were obviously clear signs of medical crisis. Despite that, he was still handcuffed. He was pulled into the police station and became naked from the waist downwards. And we are not sure why. Various reports suggest that this was a consequence of him being pulled into the police station, that his trousers fell down and his underwear fell off too. There's dispute over that. But the point is that he was clearly in a sign of distress, and he was still handcuffed and restrained. The signs of his medical crisis and distress were apparent, and there's a CCTV recording which is available, and on which you can overhear the police officers discuss and dismiss those signs as being fake, and or that he's trying to he's faking. He's trying to mislead the police officers. So that goes on for some time. There's 11 minutes of recording on the CCTV, at which point one of the police officers takes a closer look and discovers he's not breathing, and then initiates a call for an ambulance.
And then the next column that you highlight here is mistreatment of the family of Mr.
Yeah.
Alder.
So the family were not fully and properly informed as to the circumstances of his death, and faced a real battle, a real struggle to discover the details of what occurred on the night, and subsequently what was involved in the process of his death in police custody. But that's the information that wasn't shared with them. And what transpired subsequently is that they were put under police surveillance, including on matters which were of legal privilege. And so effectively they were being monitored in terms of how they were raising concerns about how Christopher died in police custody.
Was it explained why they were being monitored?
No, there was no legal reason for them to be monitored.
Who was monitoring them?
Whole police, including Janet Adler being followed by a police officer in an unmarked car for a period of time.
And then you say in your table in 2011, some further information was revealed.
Yes, the family discovered that they'd been given the wrong body and that they'd buried somebody else. And the police had sent the wrong body to the funeral services. And there's again some dispute on behalf of the family as to whether or not the police knew they'd done that.
And that's 13 years after he died.
And that wasn't information that was forthcoming, that's information that the family had to ascertain and raise with the funeral service, and from there take up through legal means and challenge, and at which point the police confirmed that they were right.
And then you have another column on the right-hand side, public briefings, misinformation.
Yeah. So the family, from the very outset, felt that the narrative which was being established about Christopher's life and death was one which presented him as a problem, as a criminal, as someone prone to engage in violence. And one of the means through which that was pursued was the characterization of him as coming from a troubled family in a broken home. All the children were brought up in care. Christopher, was a paratrooper in the British Army. He'd had a very successful career. He was training to be a computer programmer. The fact of the release of this information, the family feel, was primarily as a means to discredit their inquiries and their concerns.
Was it ever discovered who was releasing this information?
No.
And you say here on the table, confidential social service records of all the Alder children who were brought up in care were leaked also. But the source of that leak was never discovered.
Not as far as I'm aware, no.
And no doubt that caused great upset to the family.
It did. In addition to the trauma and the bereavement, they were faced with having to answer questions on topics which were of no relevance to the death in police custody.
And looking at the next case that you've highlighted here, Sean Rigg, my understanding is that he died in Brixton Police Office and there was an IPCC investigation. The terms of reference for that were specified whether the acts of the police officers were motivated by ethnicity but as I understand the position, the IPCC failed to address that issue and the issue of race. And subsequent to that, an independent external review was carried out, which recognised that and identified that there had been that failure to investigate race.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk us through your table where you draw out these themes in relation to Mr. Rigg.
Yeah. So Sean Rigg was restrained for approximately 8 minutes in the prone position throughout. He died following that restraint in the police station. He was actually in the prior to being brought into the police station, he was left in the police van outside for an extended period of time, which wasn't revealed to the family in the first instance. So he'd been arrested outside a halfway home, effectively, somewhere that he was living, and he had a key, but he was clearly having a mental health crisis. The police arrested him for stealing his own passport, and indeed suggested that there was an attempted assault. And then took him into custody. He was restrained and he was left in the police van for an extended period of time outside the police station. And then when he was taken to the police station, he was still restrained. He was still in the prone position. Whilst he deteriorated, the signs of medical distress again were seen to be those of one of faking. The police officers failed to grasp that he was a vulnerable person. He should have been taken to A&E rather than into the police station and locked in the cell. The IPCC investigation found a litany of failures, that the restraint lasted a wholly inappropriate period of time, that the police had failed to uphold his basic rights, and that there were grounds for gross misconduct charges to be brought against a number of police officers who attended the scene and took him into custody.
You mentioned in the first column there that during the restraint in the prone position that an officer's body weight was applied. Do you have any recollection of that aspect?
Well, yes, he was restrained on the scene outside his point of arrest, and the police officer, whilst they restrained him, used body weight to put him into the prone position. When he was taken into the van, he was restrained with his arms in a stacked position behind his back, but also his legs were restrained with leg restraints. And so he was face down in the van for an extended period of time. This is prior to arriving at the police station. And when they arrived at the police station, excuse me, there was delay. I think they waited outside the police station. I think it's around 8 to 11 minutes. And that wasn't initially disclosed. Again, that was something which the family learned of through inquiry and through litigation. And there was also a claim that a police officer had gone and checked on his welfare during that period of time, which turned out not to be true.
And you speak there of mistreatment of the family. Now, I should say that we are hopeful to hear from Marcia Rigg as part of the evidence of this hearing, But I'm interested in the items that you've drawn out here. So if we could look at your entry regarding mistreatment of the family, could you tell us about that?
So Marshal Rigg says that the press release was issued before the family was notified, which seems somewhat shocking. She also says that the autopsy was conducted without notification or a chance to identify Sean Rigg. That the family weren't able to see the body in close proximity, as behind a screen. And in the context of a sudden bereavement, all of those exacerbate the trauma.
And you say in public briefings misinformation.
Yeah.
There are some elements that were also drawn out regarding that.
Yes, well, the allegation that he'd stolen the passport, which was his own passport. Presumably he was carrying it for self-identification. There was an assertion that he'd attempted to assault a police officer. And that he was arrested on the grounds of public disorder. Again, I mean, what is omitted is as important as what is stated, that he was a vulnerable person in a mental health crisis and should have been the object and subject of care. But he's presented as a criminal presenting a clear and present threat to the public.
And you said those briefings were anonymous.
Yes.
Was there ever any evidence available as to who was making those briefings?
Not that I've seen.
And again, although we'll hear in the future, hopefully from Marcia Rigg herself, was it acknowledged that this was caused great upset to the family?
Yes, immensely. Yes.
And then looking at Olly Lewis from 2010, my understanding is that Mr. Lewis died in a psychiatric hospital after police restraint. And although the coroner acknowledged race as, this is in quotations, as the elephant in the room, he refused to allow the police officers to be asked during the inquest about the role that race may have played in the death of Mr. Lewis. And in fact, the jury at the inquest were not asked to consider any questions regarding race.
Yeah.
Can you explain the themes that you've brought out in relation to Lewis?
So, Mr. Olly Lewis, he was 23, he died following a prolonged restraint by Metropolitan Police officers at Bethlehem Royal Hospital in 2010, which is a psychiatric hospital. A 2017 inquiry found that excessive force was used, that it was disproportionate, and that contributed to Mr. Olly death. He was restrained by 11 police officers at 2 intervals, I believe, but for significant periods of time, and that he was restrained with 2 sets each of leg restraints and handcuffs, and that during the restraint he was also struck with a baton 3 times. The inquest jury unanimously condemned the actions of the police and healthcare staff who watched on as Olly Lewis was restrained in this way. And the police officers, in their statements to the inquest, talked about how they heard his signs of medical distress as feigning, and indeed that they'd left the room so that they could test whether or not he was feigning, but also the ways in which, the longer quote is, the sound and tone didn't suggest he had difficulty breathing. This is a police officer to the inquest. More something on the inside of him, an aggression and a ferociousness that couldn't be controlled. We didn't immediately call a doctor when he became unresponsive because we weren't 100% sure if he was definitely unconscious or not breathing. We left the room in case he was feigning passing out to escape as a ploy. end quote. And gross misconduct charges against 6 police officers were dismissed and no officer was charged for his death. But the family and family supporters were successful in introducing a law, Senny's Law, the Mental Health Unit's Use of Force Act, which received royal assent in 2018.
And under the column mistreatment of the family, what do you highlight here?
Well, Mr. Nasar Lewis, he was voluntarily admitted
To the hospital?
to the hospital, seeking care with his family. And his family were reassured, excuse me. And both he and his family were reassured that if he deteriorated or if he needed help, the parents would be contacted and they would come. And neither the hospital nor the police contacted his parents. The hospital called the police in the first instance, and then neither called his parents. And his parents, you know, have had to live and manage that a promise was undertaken that they would be there to support, and the hospital failed to honour that.
And then you also mention a theme regarding public briefings and misinformation. What have you noted in relation to Mr. Lewis?
Yes, a statement from his mother that the full details of the case and the nature of restraint wasn't revealed to her by the hospital or the police officers, but a journalist who came looking for comment, which she states as the beginning of a 10-year nightmare, which we are still walking. So in the context of bereavement, dealing with the trauma and the loss, to discover that not from a trained professional but from a journalist exacerbates that.
And the circumstances were known to the journalist before the family?
Yes. I mean, that's the key point, isn't it?
And was it ever known who had briefed the journalist or provided that information?
Not as far as I'm aware. Not as far as I'm aware. There's an asymmetry in all of these where the family, the power asymmetry where the family don't have contacts with journalists. They don't know how to communicate their story or their concerns. And so from the very outset, they're both coping and dealing with the trauma of the loss in the most harrowing of circumstances, and a narrative which is being established in the media, which they have no way of meaningfully rebutting.
And so not only can you discern patterns emerging from those 3 cases alone, but you've said there are other
Yes.
cases where these patterns can be seen to emerge.
Yes.
And these involve deaths of black men
Yes, very
in
much so.
Police custody
Yeah.
or after police contact.
I was looking at cases in Cardiff. Mohamed Bashir, 29-year-old man with Sudanese heritage who died following contact with Gwent police, and that was in 2021. Very similar features to this. Mohad Hassan, 24-year-old with Somali heritage, who died following police restraint in Cardiff in 2021, and I had 60 others on a sheet that I was working through.
And in relation to these particular cases and the others, does it appear that these are themes which are appearing again and again and again
Yes.
over a substantial period of a number of years?
Yes.
And that's even where there have been inquests and reviews
Yes.
and IPCC investigations.
Yes.
And at least on some occasions, from what you've been saying, Professor, it has been recognised that there has been a failure to address issues of race, that race has been the elephant in the room and may not have been addressed, and that there has been findings of mistreatment, of family members. Would that also include mistreatment of friends and those associated
Yes.
with the deceased?
Yes, yes.
Not just restricted to family?
No, no.
And that in relation to the involvement of media and information being shared with the family, that they may be not given information,
Yes.
have to fight for information with litigation,
Yes,
or they're given incorrect
Yes.
information.
yes, yes.
And from your knowledge of those cases, are those examples of evidence that's been available, which on occasion has been found to have substantiated an inference of racial bias or
very much so.
discrimination?
Yes, very much so, very much so. Sometimes it's obvious. I mean, in the case of Christopher Alder, you know, there's a language reference to him as coloured, of Negroid appearance. You described the recording on the CCTV footage of monkey chants being made, which the officer claimed was not towards Christopher Alder, but in relation to another person in the police station. So that's pretty unambiguous. But in other cases, the cues are different. They're more subtle. And then they go back to this language about superhumanization, of size, of imminent threat, of behaving not as somebody in medical distress or crisis, but as somebody who may be faking. Yeah.
Now the chair, in terms of the terms of reference, will have to consider the evidence that he has heard during the inquiry, and he will be required to consider inferences, possible inferences that should or may not be drawn from that evidence. But if the chair is looking for examples of other investigations or inquiries where inferences of racial discrimination have been drawn, and if he wishes to see the type of evidence that those coroners or judges or independent reviewers have relied on, are these the types of cases where he could seek those examples and consider those examples?
Yes, very much so. In addition to the actual cases, there's been a great deal of work done by the families and campaigns to establish more information that might otherwise be available. So they're very good cases to pursue that.
Thank you. And in addition to these three, which you've highlighted for us on this slide, I think yesterday you also spoke about Lord Scarman and the Chokar investigations and Simon San. And certainly in relation to Chokar and Simon San, which occurred in Scotland, there were inferences drawn and conclusions drawn that there was an absence and a failure to investigate the racial motivation.
Yes. Yes.
And in relation to those, were there also these themes emerging of, you've described it as mistreatment of the family,
Yes.
poor treatment of the family, and public briefings and misinformation? Did they also exist in Chokar and San?
They very much did. They very much did. The Jandu inquiry was leaked to the press several days before the Chokar family had any sight of it. And the Chokar family were doorstepped by national journalists to be told of the outcome and to be asked for their response.
And are these themes that are also visible from the Macpherson inquiry?
Oh yes, yes, very much so. And Lord Macpherson does pick up on that in the inquiry report. When you look for references to public briefings and misinformation, it's there. He details several cases.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you about, if we can move on from this slide, and if I ask you about this issue of faking or feigning that you've raised. And it may be that the chair has some evidence available regarding that perception or that attitude. If the officer or officers denied that they thought he was faking it because he was black and just simply say absolutely not, that was not the reason, does that alter any of the comments that you've made today? That this is a theme that appears to emerge and re-emerge in these circumstances?
No, no. I mean, I'm not sure any of the police officers would, in the 3 cases I discussed or any other, suggest that they didn't take seriously signs of medical crisis because the person being restrained was black. I'm sure all of them would deny that.
So in these cases that you've given us examples of, there were denials, but those were perhaps not accepted ultimately
Yes.
by the coroner
Yes.
or the,
Yes.
the person doing the review.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. And I'd like to return to some of the evidence that you gave us yesterday about racial stereotypes and perception. And we spoke at some length about the perception of a black man with a muscular frame and the greater perception of harm, the greater harm that that person could cause, and the consequences in terms of the response by police officers. I'd like to go back to that, please, today. If we have a situation of a young black man, 31, with muscles, physically weighing 12 stone 10, 5 foot 10 inches tall, and a BMI of 25.6. From the evidence you were giving yesterday in relation to perception, if the chair has evidence that about perception, is the type of situation you were talking about yesterday where that black man could be perceived as taller and heavier than his actual height and weight, and overall perceived as bigger or larger than his actual size, and certainly bigger than a white man of those dimensions. And is that on the basis of the US study that you spoke to yesterday?
Yes. But also in terms of the narrative which accompanies many of these inquiries, in terms of the perceptions that police officers will say that they held in encountering the person that they restrained and then arrested, that they will often talk about the person being big and bigger and appearing stronger.
And as I understood your evidence yesterday, that's on the basis that that person is black, the colour of their skin is not white.
Yes.
And as you said yesterday, and you explained the consequences of that would be, and I summarise here, it's a racial stereotype as a big, threatening black man. And that informed the methods of policing adopted. And I think that is part of your report at paragraph 134, which I won't go to at this stage, but obviously you have a hard copy. Now, you talked yesterday about that stereotype, that perception of the big black threatening man, that would expedite judgments being made. You, I think, used the phrase shorthand. I think we spoke about a shortcut to reaching judgment. And it was reaching judgment to use force against that black man. And you explained yesterday that that was also to use greater force than perhaps was absolutely necessary. And can I be clear that when you describe that use of force and expedited judgment or shorthand, would that also include a situation where the election to use force against a black man is made much more quickly, faster, at greater speed than otherwise may have been made if it had been a white man?
I think we can make that inference from the research and the statements of police officers as the motive for the type and the nature of the restraint that they've used, yes.
Thank you. And you also talked about that perception, that racial stereotype, then causing that force to be used for a longer period than was absolutely necessary. Potentially.
Yeah.
And you've talked today about a failure to recognise a medical emergency or a medical situation where someone is in need of actual treatment. I'd like to ask you about someone who has that perception and they're hastening to judgment on the grounds of a racial stereotype and reacting in this way. Now, could that be unwitting due to unconscious bias as opposed to a conscious awareness of that? It could. And would it be possible for that person at a subsequent date to simply deny that they had acted on the basis of unconscious bias and to genuinely believe that they did not act in that way? Would that be possible?
Yes, I think. Yeah, well, yes. I suppose what work they have done to reflect on the motive for their actions in retrospect would be good to know if they feel very strongly that they didn't act in that way, in that impulsive way, on the basis of unconscious bias. But the concept and the research which looks at the way in which unconscious bias unfolds in interactions suggests that's entirely plausible, yes.
And I think you touched on this yesterday, that even if a white person was present who was, say, taller than that black man, and heavier than that black man, even if we're talking about the black man being 5'10" and the other white person being 6'4", so a difference of around 6 inches. And even if the black man was 12 stone 10 and the white man was 25 stone, so not quite, but almost double the weight. Could that perception be so strong about the black man being bigger and capable of more harm, that that perception would override the realities that existed at the scene?
Yes, it could, and it has on a number of occasions in the cases that we've discussed, where police officers are greater in number and also bigger in size, yet they still perceive a threat from the person that they're restraining. Yeah.
So it's not just the individuals perhaps being taller or heavier with equipment and training, but it's also the numbers of the officers.
Very much so. I mean, the idea of the threat and the power of the stereotype continues. Yeah.
So one individual black man against numerous white police officers, some of whom are bigger, taller, heavier.
Yes.
The perception remains that the black man is still a threat.
Still a potential threat, absolutely. And that's the case in the ones I've discussed and the others too, yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you some questions about terrorism?
Please.
Yesterday, in relation to slide 9, you talked about threat levels in the UK, and you explained the context in about 2014-2015, where threat levels in the UK had been raised from substantial to severe. And you talked about the new legislation, the counter-terrorism legislation, the impact that had on travel in and out of the UK. And you talked about the 2015 YouGov poll. And I think you discussed this in more detail in paragraph 341 of your report. So if a police officer in 2015, during this period, gave a statement and said, "I was also thinking at that point of the Lee Rigby incident in London, mainly due to the fact of the coloured male and the potential terrorist connotations." If that statement was to be interpreted by the chair as potentially making a direct connection, a direct link between the colour of the man's skin, i.e. black, and potential terrorist connotations, could that situation, if you take that from me, could that be a description that's indicative of the type of example you were talking about yesterday regarding terrorism?
Yes, and that's a clear case of racial profiling of a potential quote-unquote terrorist. You're using signs of colour and you're using the prevailing anxiety about the increased threat level.
And if other comments were available for the chair's consideration, which do not make perhaps potentially such a direct link or a direct connection, but talk of considering terrorism, talking about the UK threat level, talking about Lee Rigby, considering something called suicide by cop. Are these, would that make any difference to your view of racial profiling? That they were not making that direct link. Would that alter your evidence on that in any way? No. And if an officer in 2015 had made a comment such as ISIS staying in the station, ISIS being a reference to a terrorist organisation, potentially, in relation to a custody who was not white. Would that type of comment be indicative of racial profiling or a racial stereotype of some sort?
Racial stereotype, Islamophobia, racial profiling. Yes, all of those. Right. Very much so.
Right. And if a black man was seen or perceived as a Muslim and believed perhaps to be in possession of a knife, none of that information can I take from your evidence would make him appear, or the perception of him to be less of a harm or less of a threat or less of a risk?
No.
And where the person was viewed perhaps both as black and a Muslim, is that what you were talking about yesterday about intersectionality?
Yes, it can be. In the context of a heightened generalized anxiety about Islam and Muslims and the perception of a prevailing threat interacting with the established stereotype of black criminality, yes, very much so. You can see the intersection of those two grounds.
And that is partly what you were talking about yesterday with the YouGov poll
Yes.
from 2015. Can I ask you about something else you've mentioned in your report, superhumanization bias? And I think that's in paragraphs 1.3.4 and 1.3.5 of your report. And I think in relation to this, you also mention in text box 5, Olusani Lewis again. And where there are examples of superhumanization, and that can be identified, can this be indicative of the existence of racial bias or potential racial bias?
Yes, absolutely.
So if there was evidence that during a telephone call that an officer described a black man as he's basically the size of a house, now would that be superhumanization or would that be racial stereotyping?
Well,
or does it matter?
I don't think it matters. I think we're getting into semantics now. I think that's clearly a highly racialized statement about the size and therefore the threat of a black man.
Thank you. And if a person subsequently was asked about this comment and explained that he had not been aware of a stereotype that black men were bigger or stronger or more aggressive, but equally then described the black man as well built, described him as a unit in sports terms, that he was muscly, powerful or athletic, would that diminish any of the comments you've made about racial comments?
No, not at all. And it's consistent with the study that we talked about yesterday in terms of the muscularity bias and the harm bias, the interaction between those two perceptions.
And I think yesterday you talked about people looking at black athletes and that reinforcing the beliefs that they had.
Yes.
Can I ask you about the use of the word coloured? Now, if there was evidence that officers had used that word, either coloured or black coloured male, could you assist the chair in helping him see that in the context of 2015? Now, I know that yesterday you spoke about how words can change, the meanings and the connotations of words can change. You said in the civil rights movement there was a reclamation of the word black, which may at one time have been offensive or potentially offensive, but became a word that they owned and retrieved.
Yeah.
And could you help the chair understand that in 2015 the use of that word coloured, whether that would be considered potentially in a negative or an offensive way?
Yes. So coloured has always been an offensive term in this country. It's never been a term which black or ethnic minorities have adopted as a legitimate self-categorization. I mean, the provenance of coloured is very much apartheid contexts and the US. So the term has a US provenance, used in the context of segregation, segregation of space, but also segregation obviously of resources and services and so on. But it was also used in South Africa in terms of, gradations of colour. So, Europeans, and then there were gradations of black and then brown. But it's always carried with it a hierarchy of status. I can see how it could also be reclaimed in terms of the use of categories, but in this country it's always been a derogatory term. It's never been an appropriate term. It's not been a term that minorities have used to self-define. It's not been a term that the state or public administration has used and adopted to understand population profiles.
And so in 2015, that would not have been an acceptable term to use even in that period?
No.
And if subsequently a person had been asked about that and said that they had been trying to be polite, they'd made a mistake and used the incorrect term, would that assertion of they were trying to be polite alter your evidence in relation to the word?
If people have made a mistake and they've recognised the mistake and tried to correct it, what concerns me is that people in public life and people serving the public shouldn't be making these mistakes. This should be an elementary basis of training. How you engage and how you refer to the public would seem like a...
And would you be surprised if that person simply couldn't remember any police training which specifically covered offensive terms to educate them about that?
Yes. I would be. Yes. Because it's a requirement. It's an elementary requirement.
Thank you. Can I ask you about another word? And you've not mentioned this word in your report. It's zombie.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could assist the chair by providing some context to the use of that word in connection with a black man.
Yeah, no, zombie, when we talk about zombie, we might think of movies and zombie movies and so on. The provenance of zombie comes from the Haitian Revolution and the Haiti being a former French colony which overthrew its colonial and slave overseers, the French state as it was then. But the narratives of blackness became associated with voodoo, that black people had become possessed. They were neither living nor dead. They were in a zombie state. So that's the provenance of the term, and it reappears at various points. It reappears in the American South. It's been an important part of white supremacy in the US. The language gets picked up in other contexts too. It can be uncoupled from that when you're talking about zombie movies and popular culture, but to use it to describe a black man, yeah, I mean, obviously, it carries that insinuation, it carries that history, whether or not the intention is to offend. But the provenance of the term and its use historically has been a means to dehumanize black men.
So when used in relation to a black man, that is rooted in a discriminatory and racial.
Oh yes, very much so.
And again, I'd like to ask you about a reference to gangsters or a gangster, and not necessarily in relation to the black man himself, but to suggest that that he was a heavy for a local gangster type chap, and reference to perhaps having been involved in the gangster type chap having been involved in a shooting of some description. So gangster type behaviour. When that word is used in relation to a black man, or it's suggested he was associated with someone of that sort, can you help the chair put that into context?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's consistent with a long history of tropes about black criminality, that there's an inherent relationship between blackness, black men, and different types of crime. This takes us back to Scarman and his description of stereotypes and the association between young black men and black criminality, in his terms. He called them black boys and black criminality. Black boys and criminality. But there's a popular culture narration of black men as gangsters, which comes from an American tradition of thinking about drugs and crime too, and the portrayal of young black men. So the association is saturated with multiple layers and histories of racism, simply put. Yeah.
Can I move on to something different, away from that language, and ask you about data collection? And this is something that you do raise in your report, and you talk about in some detail. And you also mention from Lady Angelini's report on deaths in police custody, and that's at paragraph 135. You've commented on the use of force by officers and instances where the use of force is disproportionate to the risks posed by black men. And I'd like to ask you about where that use of force is recognised as being disproportionate to the risks, or effectively in a shorthand, that's excessive force. Do you know how this is monitored or audited by Police Scotland, for example?
I've looked at that, and I can't find it. Well, certainly I can't find enough of a data set to be able to do anything meaningful with. Is it? I don't know whether or not it exists or if it's publicly available, but it's not something I've been able to gauge on the internet.
I don't wish to go down that route with you, and there may be issues about that, but in terms of you as a specialist in this field, have you found sufficient data sets and information available to you publicly or from any other source in relation to use of force and assessments of disproportionality?
Not complete data sets, no. I found things at one time which tell me something about 1 year, but a complete data set would have a full demographic profile, which would give me the race and ethnicity of the person, the age, gender, the year, the nature and the content of the use of force and so on. I haven't found that. I haven't found anything which will tell me a longitudinal story.
Now, I've been advised that the Police Scotland now have something called a stop and search dashboard, which is an interactive tool designed to provide a breakdown of stop and search figures, allowing police officers and the public to view and understand any trends on specific age groups, gender and ethnicity, at a local and national level. Is that something that you're familiar with? Have you used that?
I use the SPA data, so I didn't use that, no.
Right, all right. Thank you.
The data in that, I suspect, is no more up to date than the SPA data, because normally there's normally a year's lag before the data is reported, and the SPA data is 2023.
So insofar as there is data on that, you've used the SPA,
Yeah.
Scottish Police Authority's data,
Yeah.
to rely on. Thank you. Now, if there was evidence available to the chair from officers about how often members of response teams would attend a knife incident, about whether officers in attending those knife incidents had used force at all when they responded, whether they'd used batons, whether they'd used sprays, and there may be evidence available to the chair, it will be a matter for him, that rarely on those occasions when officers attended knife incidents was equipment used. So batons, sprays, anything of that sort. In terms of that evidence that's available to the chair, it doesn't form part of a formal data set, as you've been describing and you've relied on. But would you see any difficulty with that sort of information being considered by the chair? Or do you think that would be... would you leave that up to the chair?
Well, I'd like to see it, and I think many other people would like to see it too. I mean, my understanding is that it's a statutory requirement to have use of force recorded and made available, not partially but in whole, and I can't find it. So if there's a compilation of evidence, which is, I'm sure it'll be accurate and put to good use by the chair, but the bigger question is that this should be recorded and made publicly available as is required.
And I think in your report you mentioned even an FOI request has been unable to obtain the sort of data that you would like to see.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Not very much so. So a number of researchers working with bereaved families have really struggled to get the information that they would like, and researchers who have been working with bereaved families trying to understand the rates of death in custody or following police contact or in control. So it's beyond police service in Scotland to include mental health services. I have pieced this together with, and I refer to this as it's paragraph 324 where I give details to this. But no breakdown, categorization, explanation of the circumstances is routinely provided, making it difficult to distinguish deaths where the police may have played a direct contributing role to those where they did not. For example, a police pursuit in a car or afoot can result in death. Police may be called to a report of a person experiencing a crisis who then dies with little or no interaction. Both counts as death following contact. So that kind of fine-grained information which should be recorded and made publicly available is not at the moment.
And so from someone in your position, you found it very difficult to get that data and to be in a position to analyse these questions. And then from your final slide, I think at a different level of the families concerned, directly concerned, I think you said that one of the themes was that they've had to litigate or they've had to struggle or take a long time, a number of years before they could get information.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Can I ask you about some evidence we've heard regarding, well, first of all, you talked yesterday about, and we've talked again today about Chokar and Simon San and that 10-year period between the investigation and the death of Mr. San. And I think you speak about this at paragraph 156, page 11 of your report. And you make reference to slides 2 and 3 covered these topics. And you talked about, at that period, the Scottish Government had endorsed the Macpherson definition of institutional racism. The police had adopted the definition of a racist incident as any incident which is perceived to be racist by the victim or any other person. But in neither of those cases, and San was some years after the government and the police adopted the McPherson definition, that in neither death was racial motivation investigated by the police. I think you said that yesterday. Yes. Now, we've heard that in Scotland in 2013 that a body known as PERC were set up, which allowed where there were complaints against the police or there were deaths in custody or deaths after the police had come into contact, that rather than allowing legacy forces, as they're known, or police officers to investigate other police officers, there was a separate body called PERC who were able to be appointed to investigate those deaths. Are you aware of the organisation? Yes. And we've also, there may be evidence available to the chair that in relation to this particular death of Mr. Bio, that positive lines of investigation into racial motivation were not embarked upon in May 2015 after his death. At that stage, up until late August, early September, so for a number of months in 2015, the PERC were have been described by witnesses as taking cognizance if race issues emerged. And another witness has described that as a very passive approach, and another witness said that no positive lines of inquiry or investigation were adopted at that stage. They were taking cognizance. And without expressing any view about that evidence, I wonder if you could help the chair understand the context or see matters where there is that failure to adopt positive lines of investigation into racial motivation.
It's a very odd set of words, taking cognizance. I mean, I didn't realise it was optional because the requirement is to pursue the line of investigation from the point of it commencing, not
the point of death.
Yes. Well, the point of the investigation to the death commencing, not to commence potentially the investigation as to the racial motivation sometime later, based upon what else emerges. I don't understand the rationale for staggering it and/or pivoting back to it later. I suppose I'd say it's consistent with my view that there's not a reticence, I call it a recalcitrance, a refusal, to take seriously racial motivations from the outset.
When you talk about a reticence or a recalcitrance, on whose part are you referring?
On the investigating party, be it the police officers, be it Police Scotland, be it PERC in this case. Have
you seen that in other? Are there other examples of that in other cases?
Well, we discussed it yesterday in relation to Choker and Simon San, and the investigations into Choker and the inquiry into Simon San. Yes, in both those instances, just a deep and often inarticulated resistance to pursuing race as a motivating factor. Yes, very much so.
And if investigators consider that investigating racial motivation and what was in the mind of a person is a difficult thing to do, are you aware of any examples where that explanation's been considered acceptable? Or
a difficult thing to do in terms of not having the skill sets, or having the competence, or having the knowledge.
I couldn't answer that question, I'm sorry.
Well, presumably it might be any number of those things, so the solution is to gain the skill set, generate the competence, acquire the knowledge.
And get on with the job.
I would think so.
Thank you. It's interesting the word you use there, staggered. We've also heard some evidence that in relation to when matters proceeded to the Crown Office, who ultimately went on to consider matters, that there was, and it's been variously described, not as staggered, but as incremental, sequential, or linear approach, where there was a focus initially on criminality, potential criminality of the officers, but the issue of racial motivation would be considered at a later stage, and perhaps when another step was taken. Although, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but there may not be any evidence available to the chair that it was in fact embarked upon at a later stage. But in relation to your evidence about recalcitrance or reluctance, if I can put it that way, in terms of that linear approach, would you see this as, can you help us, the chair, understand?
I can't really. I mean, I suppose if there's a convention that inquiries take the form of a staggered approach, presumably then the practice follows the convention. But I don't understand how you can embark on an inquiry into the racial motivation into a death or into an incident without it being there at the outset. Because anything else, if you commence that later, then everything else that you've generated relationally may not make sense, or indeed they're out of kilter with one another. I mean, presumably when you commence an inquiry, you're already considering a number of different variables at the same time. And so why would you uncouple race from this?
Thank you. Can I ask you to explain another phrase, the phrase race card?
Yeah.
Have you heard that phrase before?
Oh yeah. I mean, race card is a wholly derogatory term used to describe the view that black and ethnic minorities get a free pass, or indeed that they either get a free pass, a race card, or they overstate their problem of racism to get away with something else, and or needlessly raise a complaint.
Does it have any meaning other than a negative connotation that you're aware of?
No, I mean, it's a derogatory term.
Are you aware of any examples of someone in public service using that phrase?
I hope not.
And why do you say I hope not?
It's self-evidently a means of delegitimizing concerns about racism.
And would that be, what category would that fall into?
Institutional racism.
And if it's used by an individual, could it be interpersonal racism?
Well, it could
also?
be. I mean, it depends on what context it's expressed. If it's said from one person to another, but if it's part of the process of the institution, if the person who's saying it plays a role in the institution that determines courses of action, establishes or contributes to the prevailing culture, then yeah, it's institutional racism too.
Thank you. Now, there was something I wanted to ask you yesterday, I forgot. But while you're talking about institutional racism, if I may go back to it, you referred yesterday in your evidence to the statement by the former Chief Constable Ian Livingston about Police Scotland being institutionally racist. And the chair has the benefit of a witness statement from former Chief Constable Livingston. I'm interested in whether you can have institutional racism within an organisation without having interpersonal racism, or without interpersonal racism being tolerated.
So, no, I mean, no, I mean, they interact, I think. I mean, given that interpersonal racism can also be covert, things said which aren't documented, it's quite easy to have interpersonal racism within an organisation. but typically all of these different forms of racism, necessarily interact. So even the language of race card, is a form of structural racism. That stereotype, that term, the concept, how it's been used, comes from somewhere, and if it's being reproduced today within an organisation, that speaks to the role and the function of structural racism within an institution. Presumably, if that's said between individuals, then you get to forms of interpersonal racism.
Thank you. You touched upon, when we were looking at your final slide, about engagement with the media, journalists, and I'd like to ask you, you've talked about that pattern emerging. If the chair has evidence regarding an article in a newspaper, which was described by a witness as promoting aversion, with Mr. Bio obviously being described as a large man who had attacked a petite female officer, and the response was it was reinforcing a stereotypical view. And when the witness was asked, when you say stereotypical, what do you mean? And the answer was, of a black man who was the aggressor. And again, without expressing any comment on the actual evidence, is that narrative of an aggressive black man attacking a petite female officer, could that potentially fall within the descriptions you've described as racially stereotypical?
Yes, very much so.
And even if it is accurate that the black man was taller or heavier, and the female was smaller and more petite, does that alter your evidence in any way?
No, because that black man will be more than a black man. I mean, he'll be a father, or he'll be a resident, or he'll be other things. But to use that designation to distill him to that designation, for the purposes of promoting a story about a context in which there was threat and danger, yes, it's a deeply racially stereotypical use of the term. And
I'd like to turn now to a separate question. We did touch on this yesterday, because obviously you'll be aware the terms of reference that the chair must consider. He is required to consider how to prevent other deaths in the future. And you have given evidence about the number of deaths. Today you've talked about 60 examples that you looked at, deaths of black men. You've highlighted 3 on your final slide. And we've heard over the course of yesterday and today that these deaths have occurred over decades and continue to occur. And I think this morning you spoke about incidences in Wales, which occurred last year. So they are continuing to occur. And if we hear evidence from Lady Angelini, we're hoping that she will give some information about her deaths in custody report, which, and I quote, a disproportionate number of people from black and ethnic minority communities have died following police use of force, and a disproportionately high number of deaths of black men in restraint-related deaths. So more black men are dying than white, and they are continuing to die despite these recommendations and these inquiries and these inquests. And if the chair, as he must in the terms of reference, consider how that could be prevented in the future, and if, in line with what you've explained to us, that recommendations have been made by Scarman, Macpherson, in relation to many other things, I wondered if you had any assistance you could provide the chair about he will obviously require to come up with recommendations. And I wondered if you wanted to raise anything, any suggestions that, from your perspective as a professor in this field, may assist him in contemplating these issues.
Yeah. My suggestions and my recommendations would all fall around accountability and corporate accountability. Ensuring that senior police officers are deeming the necessity of taking an anti-racist approach as being integral to the performance of the service as a whole, rather than an after-the-event concern. But that's mandated in terms of, their role, in terms of vicarious liability we've talked about, which was one of the things which the Macpherson inquiry insisted on, or suggested, or recommended, and actually was adopted by the Scottish Executive. I'm not sure how it panned out in terms of the adoption of that recommendation by Police Scotland. But in addition to accountability within police services and the police force, also having an adjacent accountability oversight commission which is specifically focusing upon race and policing. Race gets mixed in with a whole series of other concerns, and I think that given the nature of the problem, it needs to have a specific oversight role, some kind of a commission or a body with an oversight role which is independent of PERC, and that has teeth, that can sanction, and isn't populated by personnel who carry across the culture of policing. Because this is one of the criticisms of independent oversight bodies, investigatory bodies, be it IPCC, IOPC and PERC, that there's a cultural transaction in terms of knowledge of policing, which is obviously a benefit in terms of understanding the processes, but it also carries with it many of the stereotypes, what we might call structural racism, those cues, that informal knowledge from one body to another. I think we need an independent oversight commission which is independent of policing culture and policing practice, but that has teeth to enforce and monitor policing activity on the question of race.
And in relation to that, when you use the word sanction, what sort of sanctions do you have in mind?
I don't know, I'd like to think about that. By sanction I mean having power which is beyond advisory. Thank you.
I'm conscious that it's nearly 11:30, and I wonder if I could have a few moments.
We'll take the break now then. We'll take a 20-minute break now. Professor Meer, you talked about accountability, as I understood it, in terms of internal accountability within the police force and corporate external accountability. Did I understand you correctly in that regard? Could you just explain to me in a little more detail what you mean by the internal accountability?
Oh, there we go. One of the recommendations which came from the Stephen Lawrence inquiry was that senior police officers would be held accountable. What was it? It was corporate liability. It was tied to their role as effectively team leader, a senior police officer, and what was it? Vicarious liability is a term that Lord Macpherson used. And I'm struck that I've never seen how that's been operationalised in Scotland, whether or not that recommendation was taken on board in the way in which it's been taken on board with police forces in England.
Can you explain what you mean by vicarious liability in this context?
Well, in this context, that senior police officers would be held responsible for failing to not just adopt recommendations, but to see their implementation, their monitoring, and their assessment of impact.
And responsible to whom?
Oh, well, responsible, I guess, to the Crown.
If you're talking about holding senior police officers responsible, then somebody would have to be responsible for judging that.
Yes.
And who would you suggest that might be?
Well, I mean, the Macpherson inquiry doesn't stipulate that so tightly. I think it allows latitude to be attentive to the governance structures within the context in which a recommendation is adopted. And I can speculate, but I'd prefer to maybe think a little bit more about that.
Perhaps we could revisit that in due course. In terms of the external body that you mentioned, there already exists, of course, the HM Inspectorate of Constabulary, which covers a wide range of policing, but does not have the powers of a regulatory body to impose sanctions. Now, when you're talking about a body focusing on race, are you referring to a body that might be focusing on race purely in relation to the police?
Yes, I am. Yes.
And how would you envisage that working in terms of the corporate accountability to such a body?
I haven't elaborated that in this report, and so there are additional questions I'd be happy to go away and give consideration to. Their questions that I've answered today on the basis of the material that I've generated, but the focus of the report wasn't those areas, but I'll be happy to elaborate further.
So you'd be willing to provide a supplementary report if I was interested in
very much so,
exploring these matters further?
Yes. But that was beyond the purview of what I was asked to prepare.
I appreciate that, yes. And I don't want to do this on the hoof with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. I have only one last issue to raise with you. And we may hear evidence from other witnesses that are due to attend the inquiry. But I understand that since 2018, there has been what's known as an ethnicity field, which can be populated in use of force forms. And they were not, that ethnicity field was not present in the forms prior to 2018. And I don't need to concern you with the reasons for that. And since 2021, so 3 years after that ethnicity field was created in the forms, Police Scotland have been publishing that data, and that's since September 2021, and produced public quarterly reports, which include data on the ethnicity of the subject and the use of force as appears recorded in the use of force forms. And I simply wanted to ask you, Were you aware
No.
of this data available?
No, I wasn't.
Right.
And that's publicly available on the Police Scotland website.
That's what I'm advised.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. I'll go and check that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that has a full demographic, because lots of these things on paper have category boxes which you can populate with information, but just with a great deal of data, they're not populated, so you can't do anything with them. But that will have the information. If I go to it, that will have a full record of the use of force according to ethnicity for a period of time. That's what I'm being told.
I personally do not
Okay.
want to provide you with that assurance, but my understanding is that we will hear further evidence from another witness, Mr. Coventry,
Okay.
in relation to this aspect. So it may be that the position becomes clearer to the chair after his evidence has been taken.
That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Are there any Rule 9 applications for... Professor Meer, would you withdraw to the witness
Of course.
room, please? We'll start with Miss Mitchell.
I'm obliged to my learned friend. There's only one issue following on her examination that I would like to raise, and it's in relation to a word that I would like the view of this expert on. The witness said, "What concerns me is people in public life and people serving the public shouldn't be making these mistakes. There should be an element of basic training in how you engage." And against that background, my question is simply, would it be appropriate in ordinary course to call to or refer to an adult black man as boy? And if not, why not?
Thank you. If you can withdraw, and Dean of Faculty, if you could come forward.
My Lord, likewise, there's only one issue that I seek to raise. There is no advance Rule 9 for those that I represent, but it arises solely from an answer given right at the end of what the witness was saying in response to Melinda Friend's questions about the newspaper article and the question of stereotyping. And I would welcome the opportunity to explore what stereotyping means in the context of that newspaper article, given that it has some impact on those for whom I act.
Thank you. Mr. Byrne.
Good afternoon, my Lord. The issue I wish to explore with the witness is in accordance with a Rule 9 that was produced in advance of today, and it bears on a talk that Professor Meer delivered in March 2017, in which it's recorded in the transcript. He said a number of things which may demonstrate he has allied himself with a particular view of the surrounding circumstances of the events on Hayfield Road. Now, he was asked about this in evidence, and he disassociated himself with those views. And what I would like to ask him is, what did he say about Sheku Bayou in 2017? And also to probe his explanation, which was that the transcriber had taken down material from slides and attributed it to him, whereas superficially that seems inconsistent, because the material put in the statement is material that seems to be comparing his physique with that of Sheku Bayou, and superficially that doesn't seem plausible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Moyer.
Sir, I have one question or one area which does follow on the Rule 9 request, but also follows upon what was asked about stop recording of race, and latterly, the last question I think the counsel to the inquiry asked was the use of police forms and then the recording of race. If I can refer your lordship to the report at 3.25 by Professor Meer, you will see that there is concern raised in that following a freedom of information request by academics in respect of the report, which is WIT 0083, nothing to see here, and this is a report published in February of 2024, produced in 2023, so it's not a historical report. The police indicated there that in response to the freedom of information, they are not required to collect or report ethnicity data, and the report, nothing to see here, indicates this strikes us as a significant lapse, especially in light of the current inquiry charged to consider whether race played a role in the death of Sheikh Ubayu during police restraint. Professor Meer also spoke about the disconnect between what organisations say they will do and what they actually do, and the loss of institutional knowledge. And assuming that the freedom of information request was correctly answered, that the police are not required to collect the ethnicity data and did not produce it, does he consider the failure to collect such data as a fundamental failing by Police Scotland to enable independent scrutiny or accountability?
Thank you. Well, I shall allow all of these lines of questioning to be pursued, so we'll do it in the same order, starting with Ms. Mitchell. And if we could have Professor Meer back, please. Professor Meer, Ms. Mitchell KC, who represents the families of Sheikh Ubayu, has some question for you.
Thank you. Hi.
Hello. Reflecting on what you said earlier in relation to some words that you were being asked about by my learned friend, you said, what concerns me is people in public life and people serving the public shouldn't be making these mistakes. There should be an elementary basis of training in how you engage.
Yes.
What I want to ask you against that background was, would it be appropriate in ordinary course to call or to refer to an adult black man as boy? And if not, why not?
So my immediate reply is no. This goes back to this discussion of dehumanization. So there's a long tradition of referring to black men as boy, which comes from North America, but through popular culture too. Not to treat them as an equivalent, equal human adult, boy. I don't know if there's parlance where in some contexts people refer to people who are friends and so on in affectionate language, which may be, but I don't understand how you can get to that stage in your professional life where it hasn't been drawn to your attention to use that language is offensive. And
what is the offence about it? Can you explain?
Yes, it's to do historically with well, it comes from slavery and then the aftermath of that and segregation and the treatment of black men not as equal citizens, especially in the American South, but more broadly, not to be of equal worth. Just like zombie dehumanizers, there's another repertoire of terms which treat black men as not as equal worth, and boy is that, to infantilize them, childlike, denigrate them, and so on. I mean, I'm sure presumably that was not the intention of the use of this term, but the fact that it's used without awareness of its provenance or that its impact is concerning.
And what is that concern?
Concern that it shows, firstly, it signals a lack of awareness on the part of the impact that words can have in professional use. But it may reflect a deeper sense that young black men aren't of equal worth.
Professor Meer, there is a usage in Scotland of the word boy referring to an adult male. For example, if you listen to a football commentary, you'd often hear a football pundit referring to a good move by the boy. So I don't think that usage would have any, certainly any overt racist aspect. And I recognise what you're saying about the history of the word in relation to black men. And I'm just wondering if I'm confronted with that kind of dichotomy, how can I judge?
So both can be true at the same time. So the point here is about being aware of the context in which you use it. If you use the term boy in the context of a football game, you're being appreciative of somebody passed the ball, or, you know, that's my boy. That's different, I think, to using it to describe a black man. You know, somebody who you're perhaps serving as a public official or whatever else. I think that there needs to be an understanding and a reflection on the use and the impact of language. And if that's not there, it suggests that there's a gap in training that would make you aware, and or that it speaks to something deeper in terms of your approach to some parts of the population. Yeah, that's what I have to say on that.
Thank you. Is that you completed, Ms.
It
Mitchell?
is, yeah.
Yes, very well. If you would withdraw, if the Dean of Faculty came over. Professor Meer, the Dean of the Faculty represents the Scottish Police Federation and certain of the attending police officers. He has some questions for you.
Professor, can I just ask you about stereotyping, please?
Yes.
I think a decent definition of the notion of stereotyping is found in the Cambridge English Dictionary as a set idea that people have about what someone is like, especially an idea which is wrong. Do you agree with that?
That could be one definition.
Yeah.
I mean, a general definition in the Cambridge English Dictionary isn't sufficient to give me a definition that I can use in a thematic fashion. Cambridge Dictionary isn't going to give me a definition of society I can use in the study of society.
No, but do you agree with me that that's really, it embodies the problem with stereotyping, because stereotyping tends to cause false perceptions and embeds prejudices?
Yeah.
Yeah. Whether or not a particular description in any given context involves stereotyping depends on the precise facts. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't actually. Because stereotyping can be used independent of the facts. It routinely is.
Well, if a description is accurate, it doesn't involve stereotyping, does it?
No, it can do.
Well, for example, you described the word unit. You said that would involve stereotyping. Now, perhaps somewhat unfairly, I have been referred to as a unit. That's not stereotyping, is it?
Yes, but
Because of body size.
in addition to other criteria, it could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if in the given facts of a particular case, an individual is acting aggressively, then it's not stereotyping to describe him as acting aggressively.
I think that the language that you're trying to suggest can be uncoupled from the context in which it's used. Can't. I mean, language functions to describe, but language also has meaning which registers and resonates with historical context, with the communities that it's directed to, with the perceptions of those who hear it in the aftermath. So I think that if you're trying to say that there's a one-to-one relationship between words and reality, yes, there is, but there's also a wider reception of those words, which echo beyond that particular context, is what I would say. So I'd be cautious about saying, because in one case a term is used to describe somebody and they have properties or characteristics which maybe resonate with that term, then it's not stereotyping. No, I wouldn't take that view. I think you need to be attentive to the wider context in which language is used.
Acknowledging the need to be careful to avoid stereotyping, you can't be advocating language which is not consistent with fact.
No, I'm not saying that.
And you can't be suggesting that the need to avoid stereotyping means that people cannot use language which is consistent with fact.
No, I'm not saying that either.
No. So if one had a situation in which an individual had taken illicit drugs, got into a fight, armed himself with a knife, attacked several cars, when confronted with the police, failed to obey lawful commands, pursued and struck a female officer at the back of the head, knocking her to the ground. To describe that as aggressive doesn't involve stereotyping, does it?
That requires a great many clauses to be agreed upon, but if all of the things that you say are true and undisputed, then yes.
It doesn't involve stereotyping, you agree?
Well, if all the things that you said are true and undisputed,
Yes. If that were established
yes.
in any given scenario, yeah. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Vice Lord.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Byrne. Professor Meer, Mr. Byrne, KC, represents the three of the attending officers. He has a question for you. Mr.
Thank you.
Byrne.
Good afternoon, Professor Meer.
Good afternoon.
I want to ask you a little bit more about a topic that you addressed yesterday morning, and it concerns a talk that you delivered in Winchester in March 2017. And if I recall your evidence correctly yesterday, a passage was read out from an extract, and that passage started with the words, "And these kind of findings occur at a time in Scotland where there is a salience of race," so on and so forth, and ended with, "So race does matter in Scotland, so it is misleading to suggest that everything is okay on that issue."
Yes.
And you were given the opportunity to comment on that extract, and if I recall your evidence correctly, you said that you hadn't used those words, and that rather an error had occurred because the person who had made up the transcript had in actual fact attributed the words of a BBC article and a Guardian article taken from a slide you'd produced and attributed that to you. Is that correct?
Yes. That's my recollection, yes.
Yes. So the question really is, why was the BBC and why were the Guardian drawing a comparison between the size and build of Sheku Bayou, drawing a comparison between his size and build and your size and build?
They weren't doing that. No, they weren't doing that. So we were talking through the race and the salience of the race. I was just looking through the printed copy of my corrected proof to see if there's any other reference actually in here.
Would it be helpful to have that on screen, because it's been produced I think in the last hour, so I've just had an opportunity to review it very briefly, and I think it has a reference, WIT-00102.
Ah, yes, great.
And I think if we drop down perhaps 2 pages, we'll get to the particular passage which we're addressing. So I think it's just there. We've just gone past it. If we can pause.
Ah, yes. So this is the corrected. So this is what I was sent, and then I made my corrections and sent it back. Yes. So this is what we're looking at.
Yeah. So what we have here is this young man, about my size and build, was suffocated at a bus stop. So my question again is, if this derives in truth from a BBC article and a Guardian article,
it doesn't.
why does it refer to your size and build?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't refer to a BBC article or to the Guardian. The BBC article and the Guardian article behind me had a picture of Mr. Bayou and a discussion, I think, of positional asphyxiation. And this transcript is made up of partly my slides, which I sent down, and also the panel discussion and conversation on the day. And the note taker clearly has tried to narrativize that in a way in which is more engaging than an academic with slides and data points. And so they've presented something for me to sign off, and I've checked it, seen that that's in it amongst other things. So if you go to the top, there's a whole joke about...
We can come to the top in a moment, but if we can just stick with this for a moment, please. So I suppose if that's your explanation, is your position to the inquiry that you did not say this young man about my size and build was suffocated at a bus stop?
I didn't say those words. I could well say, I don't know actually, it's a long time ago, it was 2017. There could have been discussion about the case, but clearly I didn't say those words because I didn't, when I saw them, I didn't recognize them, and I thought that's not accurate.
So can we perhaps just try and get some clarity? What did you say about Sheku Bayou? And did you say anything about comparing your size and build with his size and build?
No, I don't recall saying that. I don't recall saying any of this, actually.
Okay. So if we do go back to the top of the document, it perhaps reads, rather than you deleting things that you didn't say, rather it would appear that you're simply editing it for public consumption.
No, because it was a public event. So it's not as though these things were said in private. It's a public talk. And I certainly was editing it because other things in this weren't true. I mean, I didn't recognize that first section at all. I think that's been attributed to me from the other speaker.
So why would there be a discussion about your size and build at this talk?
It must have been a feature of the conversation. Somebody must have mentioned it, and it may have been included by the note taker appropriately.
But you didn't say anything about comparing your size and build, notwithstanding what we see here, with the size and build of Sheku Bayou.
I mean, I can say that again if it's helpful.
So, one final opportunity. What did you say about Sheku Bayou in 2017?
That's quite tricky because it's 2017. I didn't know that this was written up and available. Had I done so, I would have tried to reflect a little bit more before the question was raised. I can well imagine a conversation was had about the case, but beyond that, I think it's quite hard to go back and populate it with...
Well, your explanation is that you put a slide up on the board, and the slide had an article from the BBC and the Guardian.
Yes.
Is that correct? So,
and I've shared the slides.
Right. So are we to understand that you, notwithstanding you put the slide up, you didn't say anything about the incidents?
No, I can imagine there was a conversation about the event, and there's possibly a conversation about Stephen Lawrence too, but it wasn't in those terms and distilled into those sentences.
And you can't recall what it was?
Beyond what I've said, no.
But you are absolutely sure it wasn't what was recorded to be what you said?
Well, I've corrected it at the time, so I don't think so, no.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Moyer. Professor Meer, Mr. Moyer, KC, acts for the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights. Mr. Moyer.
Professor Meer, I want to ask you about paragraph 3.2.5 of your report. Now, you touched on paragraph 3.2.4 with counsel to the inquiry. But I specifically want to deal with something you raised at 3.2.5. Do you have that?
Yes, I do. Yes, go for it.
Now, during your evidence yesterday, you spoke about there being sometimes disconnects between what organisations say they will do and what they actually do, and a loss of institutional knowledge, etc. You also today, you didn't speak about it, but you were asked about forms being filled in which now record the ethnic data and stop recording. We understand that now also records ethnic data. But from your paragraph 3.2.5, you'll see you refer to a document which we have as WIT 0083, and that's nothing to see here, deaths in custody and FAIs in Scotland. And that's a recent publication from, it was published in February of 2024. I think the data was from 2023. And under the heading, which is at page 4 initially, police custody and contact, we can then go on to page 5 of that. I'll just read out what it says there. Police Scotland noted in its FOI response that it is not required to collect or report ethnicity data. This strikes one as a significant lapse, especially in light of the current inquiry charged to consider whether race played a role in the death of Sheikh Obayo during police restraint. Now, Police Scotland have said that they are an anti-racist and a proactively anti-racist organisation. If this is correct, that they do not keep any data and they're not required to keep data, do you consider the failure to collect such data as a fundamental failing by Police Scotland to enable independent scrutiny and accountability?
I do, and I don't understand the reason for it.
Thank you.
Professor Meer, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm very grateful for the work you put into this report and your evidence. I'm going to rise in order that the room may be prepared for the next witness, and you'll then be free to go.
Thank you.
So we'll adjourn briefly. Good morning, Mr. Castledine. Would you raise your hand and say the words of the oath after me, please? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Thompson.
You are Paul Castledine.
That's correct.
How old are you, Mr. Castledine?
I'm 59.
And I understand that you are a retired police officer.
That's correct.
Before I ask you any questions, can I invite you to open up the blue folder that's just to your left? And in it, you should find a copy of a statement that you gave to the inquiry. You'll see there's also a screen in front of you, Mr. Castledine, so we'll bring it up on the screen. The reference is SBPI 00594. The system seems to be having some difficulty loading the statement, but you should have a hard copy in the folder in front of you, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
So perhaps we can rely on the hard copy in the absence of the technology. And can I invite you to perhaps go to the end of that statement and confirm for me that you signed it on the 16th of May of 2024?
Yep, that's right, yep.
Lovely. And can I ask you please to look at the, what I think is the final paragraph of that report? That statement, sorry, I think it should be paragraph 31. I think it will begin with the words, I believe.
Yep.
And as I don't have the copy in front of me, oh, I do now. If we can scroll down to the final paragraph so we all have it on the screen in front of us, please. That's not going to work. I'm going to have to ask you to read out that paragraph rather than me, please. It's paragraph 31.
Okay. I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website.
Lovely, thank you. So you prepared that statement in the knowledge that it would become evidence before the inquiry.
Yes.
When you answered the questions that were put to you, did you do your best to be truthful and accurate in the responses that you gave?
I did, yes.
You explain in your statement at paragraph 2 that you joined the police in 1993, having served with the Royal Marines for 8 years before that.
That's correct, yes.
And that as a probationer, you spent your time in Cowdenbeath. And 3 years post-probation, that time was also spent in Cowdenbeath.
Yes.
Okay. You've explained too that thereafter you worked in Dunfermline, Dalgety Bay and Glenrothes.
Yes.
So these are all towns within what was historically Fife Constabulary. Did you spend all of your police career within the Fife area, even after it became Police Scotland?
No, I spent a year working through in Glasgow and Bishopbriggs. Yeah.
With the exception of that 1 year, did you spend all of your time in Fife?
I did. I was still attached to Fife, yes.
I understand that you retired from the police in 2017 after 24 years,
Yes.
having spent 23 of those years within the Fife policing
Yes.
area. What was your rank at the point that you retired?
Police constable.
You also explain in your statement that you were public order trained and firearms trained.
That's correct.
And latterly, prior to your retirement, you were a productions officer.
Yes.
I want to begin about asking you about your involvement with SEMPER. If the system will permit us, I wonder if we can bring up your statement. Okay. You have a hard copy in front of you, Mr. Castledine,
Yeah.
so do I. We're going to have to work with hard copy. But what I would like to do is look at paragraph 3 of your statement. I should have said the purpose of the hard copy is not just in case of there being a tech crisis, but also so that you have it available to you. If there's anything that you want to refer to in your statement at any point, please do that. And technology permitting, if there's anything you would like us to bring up on the screen, we can do that for you too.
Okay.
So I'm just going to read out paragraph 3 and we'll take it from there. Paragraph 3, you say, in my last 15 years, I became involved in SEMPER Scotland, which is basically the equivalent of the English Black Police Association. Our remit was to address issues minority ethnic police officers and staff face and try to overcome them, and also advise different police forces and authorities of any wrongdoings. Just try to help them do their job so we can do our job. And you explain elsewhere in your statement that you were involved with SEMPR from 2002 all the way through until your retirement in 2017, so that's a period of 15 years, and that latterly you were chairman of the association.
That's correct, yes.
So you explain in paragraph 3 that the remit of SEMPR is to address issues minority ethnic police officers and staff face and try to overcome them. Now, the SEMPR website explains that the acronym stands for Supporting Ethnic Minority Police for Equality in Race. And it goes on to say that SEMPR Scotland is the primary staff association that exists to support and represent all minority ethnic employees on issues of equality in race, and to ensure that the Scottish Police Authority and the Police Service of Scotland uphold the principles and practices of racial equality. That's your understanding of the remit of the organisation.
It is, yeah. When it says police officers, it includes police staff as well.
Officers and staff.
Yeah.
I think in due course we may hear evidence from the current chair of SEMPR, but you're the first witness from whom we've taken evidence who has an association with SEMPR, so it might be helpful just to set the scene, as it were.
Okay.
The website also explains that there are 5 key functions of the organisation, and the first is support, that you provide confidential information, advice and support to minority ethnic police officers and police staff on issues affecting them. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And was that what part of the remit of SEMPR during the period of time that you were involved with the association?
It was, yeah. The aims and objectives haven't changed much.
They haven't changed, okay. The second objective is to be an advisory body to the SPA, Police Scotland and the Scottish Government on issues of race equality. Again, was that part of the remit when
Yes.
you were involved with SEMPR? The third aim or objective is policy development, to recommend, review and support the development of policies and procedures to enhance recruitment, retention and development of minority ethnic employees. Again, is that familiar to you as being one of the aims and objectives from your time with the organisation?
It is, yes.
Fourthly, recruitment, to assist in recruitment initiatives to promote policing as a career of first choice and the police service as employers who are committed to diversity and social justice. Again, is that familiar to you?
It is, yeah.
And finally, community relations, to work with young men and women from minority ethnic communities to strengthen relations between them and the police service. Again, was that one of the aims and objectives during the time that you worked at SEMPR?
Yes, it was.
Returning to your statement, paragraph 4, it's a short paragraph, again I'll just read it out. There was always a problem with numbers. The government and the police were looking to raise the profile of police officers from minority background to recruit them and retain them. So you allude there to there being a problem. What steps were taken by SEMPR during the time that you were involved with that organisation to improve recruitment and retention of officers from minority backgrounds?
Yeah, I mean, we had been approached by various organisations, say within the police, and out with the police looking for help. And the idea was to set up an organisation which we named back then SEMPR Scotland. And our sort of job, as I say, was to help recruit and retain police officers and staff. And so we looked at ways we could do this by encouraging people to make the police service a job of choice. And often, for whatever reasons, it was looked upon as not a career of choice for people from the minority backgrounds. And we were just there to sort of encourage them and show that there are people of colour within the police service, and there was nothing to be afraid of. Yeah, we were just looking to hopefully recruit more people and just give them more opportunities. So we held open days to invite people along from different communities to attend the open days. We visited various schools, various communities to show face and speak to them and reach out to them. And it was reasonably successful in my time. I'm not sure what's happened since, but certainly in my time we were able to encourage people to apply, and the people who were struggling for whatever reason, we would offer them support with the hope that they'd stay in.
Thank you. You explain in your statement that you were laterally the chair of Semper. During what period of time were you the chair, do you recall?
Good question, no.
Or was it up to the point of your retirement?
No. So I stepped back. So I don't recall exactly. So I'd probably be making it up, to be honest. But yeah, there was a period, 2003, 2004, possibly something like that, where I was heavily involved. I was the vice chair for some time, and then I became the chair, and then I had to take a step back. Really just to sort of allow some new ideas to come in, somebody else to take over, yeah, I just came back to the force, but I was still involved.
Do you recall how long you held the position of chair to Semper?
It was under 2 years, yeah. So certainly I was seconded for a year, so it might have been just about 2 years.
How long were you vice chair before that?
I would have been maybe a year as well before that. Yeah.
Thank you. Can we look at paragraph 12 of your statement, please? And again, I'm simply going to read this out and then ask you some questions about it. I've been asked what else I worked on during my time as chairperson of Semper. It was recruitment and retention and addressing any issues that came up. The police would come to us as a body and say, look, we've got this. Can you help us? And we were able to intervene and to assist. I think that the statistic came out some years before I started, was that a minority ethnic police officer was 3 times more likely to be interviewed by their colleagues than a white officer in connection with professional standards. That was sometimes just purely because they looked at it as, it's really important that we do this right because this person is from a minority background, and it was quite shocking to me. So can I perhaps begin by clarifying what you're talking about here, and what circumstances might an officer find themselves being interviewed by colleagues in connection with professional standards?
So it's interviewed or investigated, really. But if something was reported, for instance, by a member of the public of some wrongdoing, we certainly found that if back then, if somebody from a minority background was reported, they would tend to be more likely to be interviewed or investigated by professional standards, purely because of the fact that they thought they need to do it properly, rather than just taking them into the office and saying, look, you've done wrong here. You'd forget about it this time, and nothing was put on paper. I certainly found that once it goes on paper and the paper trail starts, it would then have no way back. So I found, certainly in my time, that we would be investigated more.
I'm going to ask you some more detailed questions about your experience of being investigated, probably after lunch, but in the few moments that remain, just so I'm absolutely clear in my mind, you're describing here processes and procedures, interviews, investigations that would follow on the making of a complaint to professional standards. Is that right?
9 times out of 10, yes. Yeah, not always.
And the other 1 time out of 10?
It would be sort of kept within the police station, and there'd be something would happen within the police station where, or the force, where they can be dealt with within force, as opposed to going out and having outsiders come in and have a look at it.
Okay, but these processes of interview and or investigation would be in response to a complaint having been made about the conduct of an officer. Is that correct?
Yes, or it could be something that the officer's done, possibly as a procedural thing within the police, and so it's not necessarily a member of the public. So paperwork done incorrectly, something being mislaid or something like that.
Okay, so it could be a complaint from a member of the public,
Yeah.
or equally it could be, for example, an error in record keeping
Yeah.
that has been identified perhaps by a superior officer.
Yes.
Something that has then required to be addressed
Yes.
in some way. And as a result of these things, these issues being brought to the attention of professional standards, the complaints process could result in an interview, is that correct?
Yes, yeah. Normally when it gets to that stage, or used to certainly, you would then have a visit from them and be interviewed regarding the incident, and they would then decide whether or not it was worthy of taking it further.
And you also made reference to the possibility of an investigation. Would that be in terms of the 2014 conduct regulations?
Yes.
I'm conscious of the time. I wonder if this might
Well,
be
we'll stop for lunch now and sit at 2 o'clock.